Something fundamental has shifted in the Black Sea, and most Western audiences are not being told what it actually means. While public attention remains locked on battlefield maps in eastern Ukraine, on trenches, artillery duels, and incremental territorial gains, a far more consequential transformation is unfolding along the coast, quietly, methodically, almost invisibly. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor is not a humanitarian adjustment or a technical shipping workaround. It is a strategic signal, and it carries implications that extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. Odessa was once treated as untouchable, a rear area port assumed to be protected by geography, international law, and Western political guarantees. That assumption is now obsolete. The corridor linked to Odessa, once narrow and cautiously managed, has become a contested zone under constant pressure. And with that shift, Europe's most critical trade lifelines are no longer operating under conditions of certainty, but under conditions of tolerance. Tolerance that can be withdrawn at any time. This is not simply a story about one port city. It is not even primarily about Ukraine. What is unfolding is the gradual reconfiguration of maritime control in the northern Black Sea, a region that serves as a logistical bridge between Eurasian production zones and European consumption markets. Grain, energy inputs, fertilizers, metals, entire supply chains depend on uninterrupted access through this maritime space. When that access becomes conditional, the effects ripple outward, reaching the Danube Basin, the Balkans, southern Europe, and ultimately the industrial core of the European Union. For decades, Odessa symbolized continuity. Even during periods of political instability or regional tension, commerce moved, ships docked, contracts were honored, markets adjusted, but they did not collapse. That historical pattern created a dangerous illusion that trade infrastructure exists outside of strategic competition. Today, that illusion is being dismantled piece by piece. What we are witnessing is not a dramatic blockade with warships lined across sea lanes. Instead, it is something more sophisticated and far more effective: pressure without declaration, missile reach, drone presence, electronic surveillance, insurance risk and uncertainty layered together to reshape behavior. Ships still sail, but fewer of them. Cargo still moves, but at higher cost and higher risk. The port still exists, but its reliability, the true source of its power, is steadily eroding. And this is where the balance of power quietly shifts. Not through explosions or territorial conquest, but through leverage. Leverage over markets, leverage over governments, leverage over decision-makers who suddenly find that economic stability depends on conditions they do not control. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor is therefore not a sign of resilience. It is a sign of strain. It tells us that the old rules no longer apply, and that maritime space, once assumed neutral, is now a battlefield in all but name. To understand why this moment matters, and why it represents a turning point rather than a temporary disruption, we must step back. We must examine how Odessa became strategically indispensable, why its security was taken for granted, and how that assumption is now being systematically dismantled, setting the stage for consequences that Europe may not yet be prepared to confront. Odessa has never been just another port city. From the moment of its founding in the late 18th century, its purpose was strategic before it was commercial. Designed as a southern maritime gateway, Odessa became the primary outlet through which the agricultural and industrial wealth of the interior flowed outward. Grain from the fertile plains, coal and metals from deeper inland regions, all of it converged on Odessa before moving into European and global markets. Over time, the port was woven directly into Europe's economic bloodstream, serving as a logistical hinge between Eurasian land routes and maritime trade corridors. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Odessa's role expanded rather than stabilized. It was not simply a commercial hub, but a strategic node, one that linked political power to economic mobility. Control of Odessa meant access, influence, and leverage. That reality did not disappear with regime changes or shifting borders. It persisted through wars, revolutions, and eventually into the Soviet era, where Odessa functioned as one of the most important maritime outlets of the Soviet Union, feeding both civilian markets and industrial supply chains. When the Soviet system collapsed, many assumed that Odessa's importance might diminish. The opposite occurred. Independent Ukraine inherited one of the most valuable port infrastructures in Eastern Europe, and Odessa quickly became central to national survival. Grain exports, sunflower oil, fertilizers, steel products, and industrial inputs moved through its terminals in massive quantities. By the early 2000s, millions of tons of cargo passed through Odessa annually, supplying markets across the European Union, the Middle East, and Africa. The port was not merely profitable, it was indispensable. Then came 2014, a turning point that fundamentally altered the strategic calculus. With the absorption of Crimea by Russia, Ukraine lost Sevastopol, its primary naval base and maritime anchor. In a single stroke, Odessa shifted from being a major economic asset to a strategic necessity. It was no longer just about exports, it was about access to the sea itself. Without Odessa, Ukraine's ability to function as a trading state would be severely constrained. This reality did not go unnoticed in the West. NATO attention to the Black Sea quietly increased. Naval visits became more frequent, intelligence sharing deepened, surveillance coverage expanded. Officially, these moves were described as reassurance and deterrence. In practice, they reflected a growing recognition that Odessa had become a geopolitical fault line. By 2022, when large-scale war erupted, Odessa was no longer viewed simply as infrastructure. It had become a symbol, a node whose survival was treated as synonymous with Ukraine's economic and political viability. But symbols, no matter how powerful, do not guarantee security. Geography does not change, but control over geography most certainly does. Over the past year, a series of incremental actions, missile strikes, drone pressure, naval maneuvering, electronic surveillance, and economic coercion, have steadily transformed the operational environment around Odessa. What once appeared stable now looks conditional. What once flowed freely now moves under persistent threat. And it is precisely this shift from assumed safety to contested access that defines the present moment and sets the stage for understanding what the expansion of the Odessa Corridor truly represents. So what precisely has changed, and why does it matter now? The so-called Odessa Corridor was originally presented as a limited, pragmatic solution. It was framed as a humanitarian and commercial workaround, a narrow maritime route designed to allow export traffic to continue despite the broader war. Its viability rested on several critical assumptions: restrained escalation, predictable behavior, and the belief that informal external guarantees would be sufficient to keep the route usable. Those assumptions are no longer holding. Over recent months, Russia has steadily expanded its operational reach across the northwestern Black Sea. This expansion has not taken the form of a traditional naval blockade, with surface combatants visibly sealing off sea lanes. Instead, it has unfolded through layered, persistent pressure designed to reshape behavior rather than provoke immediate confrontation. Missile coverage from Crimea now extends deep into maritime approaches. Drone strikes have periodically targeted port-related infrastructure, not to destroy it completely, but to remind operators that vulnerability is constant. Sea denial capabilities ranging from naval mines to unmanned surface systems have made routing unpredictable. Overlaying all of this is continuous intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance activity, turning the northern Black Sea into a monitored operational environment rather than a neutral commercial space. The effects of this strategy are subtle, but they are decisive. Shipping insurers quietly raise premiums. Some refuse coverage altogether. Operators delay departures or reroute vessels. Port throughput slows, not because cranes are destroyed, but because confidence has been eroded. Grain shipments in particular become irregular, forcing exporters to seek longer and more expensive alternatives. None of this requires a formal declaration of blockade. It requires only uncertainty, applied consistently over time. This is classic sea denial doctrine. The objective is not total control of maritime space, but sufficient dominance to impose costs on anyone attempting to use it. Russia does not need to stop every ship, it only needs to make each voyage a calculated risk. When commerce depends on predictability, even modest disruption produces outsized effects. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor itself reflects this pressure. Routes become longer, narrower, and more exposed as ships attempt to avoid perceived threats. Each additional mile increases vulnerability, to surveillance, to strike systems, to insurance cancellation. What is marketed as adaptation is in reality evidence of constraint. Importantly, this strategy avoids the political consequences of a direct assault on Odessa. The port city remains in Ukrainian hands. Its infrastructure largely stands, but its functionality, the very reason it matters, has been degraded. From a strategic perspective, this is far more efficient than occupation. A port that exists but cannot reliably operate at scale is effectively neutralized without triggering automatic escalation thresholds. This brings us to the central strategic question. The issue is not whether Odessa has fallen, it clearly has not. The real question is whether Odessa can continue to function as the economic engine it once was under sustained pressure, and if it cannot, then the implications extend far beyond Ukraine, forcing us to confront what this shift means for Europe, for NATO, and for the broader balance of power in the maritime domain. From a strategic standpoint, this is where Western analysis most often goes wrong by focusing obsessively on territory instead of systems. Maps dominate the conversation, control lines are scrutinized, cities are labeled as held or contested. Yet ports, trade routes, and logistics networks do not derive their power from ownership alone. They derive it from reliability. And once reliability disappears, economic value collapses regardless of who technically controls the ground. This distinction is critical to understanding what is happening around Odessa. Russia has not attempted a frontal seizure of the city, and that restraint is often misread as weakness or hesitation. In reality, it reflects strategic discipline. Occupying Odessa would require significant ground forces, prolonged urban combat, and would almost certainly trigger escalatory responses from the West. Instead, Russia has chosen a more efficient path, one that neutralizes Odessa's function without incurring the costs of occupation. By applying sustained pressure to maritime access, Moscow is turning Odessa into what might be called a theoretical port. It exists on paper. Infrastructure remains standing, but its ability to operate at scale with predictability and commercial confidence is steadily eroded. From a systems perspective, that outcome achieves many of the same objectives as capture, without crossing the political thresholds that outright seizure would entail. This is not a tactical improvisation. It is an operational strategy aligned with broader economic warfare. By constraining Ukraine's export capacity, pressure is transmitted outward into European markets. Grain disruptions push food prices upward. Fertilizer delays affect agricultural output months later. Insurance instability creates shipping bottlenecks far beyond the Black Sea itself. These effects compound over time, and crucially, they do so without generating dramatic headlines. What makes this approach especially effective is that it exploits a fundamental Western vulnerability. Dependence on uninterrupted trade flows combined with a declining willingness to secure those flows through direct military means. Modern European economies are optimized for efficiency, not resilience. They assume predictability. When predictability vanishes, decision-makers face choices for which they are politically unprepared. This is where NATO enters the equation. NATO naval forces are present in the broader region, but their freedom of action is constrained. Legal limitations, escalation concerns, and internal political fragmentation restrict their ability to impose dominance. Observation is possible, signaling is possible, but persistent sea control, the kind required to restore confidence to commercial shipping, is far more difficult. As a result, Russia retains the initiative. It does not need to escalate dramatically. It simply needs to maintain pressure at a level that NATO is unwilling to counter decisively. Over time, that imbalance favors the actor prepared to accept economic friction as a tool of strategy. The deeper implication is this: the Black Sea is no longer a peripheral theater. It has become a proving ground for a form of conflict in which economic systems are targeted indirectly, and where the absence of explosions does not equate to the absence of damage. And if this model continues to prove effective, if pressure produces results without triggering direct confrontation, the next logical question becomes unavoidable. How far can this approach be expanded, and what happens when economic coercion begins to intersect with broader escalation dynamics? From this point forward, the trajectory is no longer linear. What lies ahead is not a single outcome, but a spectrum of escalation paths, each shaped by restraint, miscalculation, and structural pressure. None of these paths offers stability. They differ only in how risk is distributed and who absorbs the cost first. The most likely scenario is the normalization of disruption. In this model, nothing dramatic occurs, no decisive strike, no formal blockade. Instead, shipping adapts under pressure, insurance premiums remain elevated, transit times increase, cargo volumes shrink. Incrementally, Odessa continues to function, but as a diminished node, a secondary port, rather than the economic engine it once was. This form of slow economic attrition is particularly dangerous because it rarely commands political urgency, yet over time, it erodes Ukraine's export capacity and weakens Europe's supply resilience without a single clear moment of crisis. A second scenario involves the gradual militarization of protection. Ukraine, supported by Western partners, could attempt to harden port defenses, expand air defense coverage, and introduce convoy-style maritime protection. On paper, this appears stabilizing. In practice, it introduces new risks. Escort operations increase the likelihood of close encounters, misidentification, and escalation, especially involving drones, intelligence surveillance platforms, or air defense systems operating near contested airspace. Any incident involving NATO assets would instantly elevate the conflict from indirect pressure to direct confrontation risk. The third scenario is horizontal escalation. Pressure applied in one area rarely remains contained indefinitely. As access near Odessa becomes more constrained, attention shifts westward toward the Danube Delta, overland transit corridors, and ports in neighboring states such as Romania. At that point, the issue is no longer framed as Ukraine's economic survival, but as Europe's. Energy infrastructure, river transport, and secondary ports become part of the pressure environment, widening the strategic footprint of the conflict without changing its underlying character. Then there is the nuclear dimension, not in the sense of imminent use, but as a constant shaping force. Nuclear-armed states do not need to threaten employment explicitly for deterrence to operate. The mere presence of strategic weapons constrains decision-making, narrows escalation ladders, and encourages indirect methods of competition. In this environment, economic warfare becomes the preferred tool, precisely because it operates below the threshold that would justify catastrophic retaliation. What these scenarios share is an absence of resolution. None restores the pre-war assumption of free and predictable maritime trade. None removes uncertainty. Instead, each redistributes risk onto insurers, consumers, peripheral states, and ultimately civilians, who experience the effects months later through prices, shortages, and instability. This is the defining characteristic of modern great power competition. The battlefield is no longer confined to front lines. It extends into logistics systems, financial instruments, and trade routes. The damage accumulates quietly but relentlessly, and as this accumulation continues, its consequences move outward, from strategic calculations and policy debates into the daily lives of millions, forcing us to confront not just geopolitical outcomes, but the human costs that inevitably follow. Behind every disrupted shipment lies a chain of consequences that rarely appears on a battlefield map. These effects unfold slowly, often invisibly, but they shape political stability and human security far more persistently than artillery fire. The pressure applied to Odessa's maritime access does not remain confined to Ukraine's coastline. It travels outward, through supply chains, markets, and societies that depend on predictability rather than resilience. For regions already operating at the margin, the impact is immediate. Grain exports from the Black Sea are not abstract commodities. They are foundational inputs for food systems across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. When shipments are delayed or rerouted, prices rise. Governments subsidize what they can, but fiscal space is limited. The result is a familiar pattern: higher food costs, increased public dissatisfaction, and political stress that has little to do with ideology and everything to do with affordability. Europe experiences the effects differently, but no less significantly. Manufacturing supply chains depend on timely delivery of raw materials, fertilizers, and energy-related inputs. When shipping becomes unpredictable, inventories thin, production schedules slip, costs increase, insurance markets, responding rationally to elevated risk, tighten coverage and raise premiums, compounding the problem. These costs do not disappear, they move downstream, eventually reaching consumers through higher prices and reduced availability. Within Ukraine itself, the human dimension is even more direct. Port workers, logistics managers, customs officials, and entire regional economies depend on Odessa's throughput. As activity slows, employment contracts, municipal revenues shrink, infrastructure repairs, already costly under wartime conditions, become continuous rather than episodic. Yet unlike cities near the front lines, these communities suffer without visibility. There are no dramatic images, no viral footage, only steady economic erosion. This is the quiet side of modern warfare. It does not dominate headlines, but it determines endurance. States can absorb battlefield losses if their economies function. They struggle when economic pressure accumulates silently, month after month, without relief. Strategic planners understand this well. That is why trade disruption has become such a powerful tool. It targets societies indirectly, exploiting the gap between public perception and structural vulnerability. For Europe, the lesson is increasingly difficult to ignore. The assumption that maritime commerce exists outside geopolitical competition has been decisively shattered. Trade routes are no longer neutral corridors. They are strategic terrain. Lifelines that are not defended, diversified, or structurally protected become points of leverage for any actor willing to apply pressure patiently. This reality forces uncomfortable questions. How much economic disruption can European societies tolerate before political consensus fractures? How long can markets absorb uncertainty before risk becomes systemic? And perhaps most importantly, who bears responsibility for securing the arteries on which modern economies depend? These questions do not belong solely to economists or military planners. They belong to policymakers, voters, and societies that have grown accustomed to stability without recognizing the conditions that sustain it. And as these pressures converge, economic, political, and social, we arrive at the final consideration: what this moment reveals about the future of European security and whether decision makers are prepared to confront the strategic warning now clearly emerging from the Black Sea. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor is not a solution. It is a symptom, and symptoms, when ignored, do not resolve themselves. They worsen. What this development ultimately signals is a structural shift in the Black Sea from guaranteed access to conditional tolerance. For decades, European trade planners, political leaders, and economic institutions operated under a shared assumption: maritime commerce, once established, would remain insulated from sustained geopolitical pressure. That assumption no longer holds. Control of sea space is no longer binary. It is no longer a matter of peace or blockade. It is now a matter of leverage, applied incrementally and withdrawn selectively. This is the defining feature of the current strategic environment. Rather than territorial conquest, we are seeing economic coercion. Rather than dramatic escalation, we are witnessing persistent pressure. Trade routes, once treated as neutral infrastructure, have become instruments of state power. When access is no longer automatic, every shipment becomes a calculation, every voyage a risk assessment, and every delay a political signal.